The world gasped when an African soldier turned president did what no Western superpower had managed in decades. He brought Israelis and Palestinians to the same table and forced silence upon their guns. For over 70 years, the Middle East has been drenched in blood, with peace talks collapsing like sandcastles under the tide of mistrust. Yet from the landlocked heart of West Africa came a voice that dared to say, enough. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso was only 37 years old when he placed Africa at the center of global diplomacy. He declared that the wisdom of a continent long ignored would achieve what armies and billion-dollar peace plans had failed to deliver. Out of Ouagadougou, a challenge was issued, not of bullets, but of dignity, sovereignty, and moral authority. What followed would shake the foundations of global politics. If one small nation scarred by terrorism could step into the world's most intractable war, what stopped the rest of the continent from rising? Stay with us. This is not just a headline. It is history being rewritten before your eyes. Subscribe, stand with the story, and keep watching. The year was 2025, and the air in the Middle East was heavy with despair. Rockets arced over Gaza, sirens wailed in Tel Aviv, and children grew up counting days, not by school lessons, but by bombardments. For decades, the great powers of the world had come and gone, promising peace, delivering nothing. Washington, Brussels, Moscow, each had tried, each had failed. Peace had become a ghost story told at conferences, a word that carried more cynicism than hope. Then from a place the world least expected, a new voice rose. Burkina Faso, a small landlocked nation often mentioned only in the context of poverty or insurgency, declared that it would step into the diplomatic void. On the 15th of May, standing in Ouagadougou before his people and the watching world, Captain Ibrahim Traoré announced that Africa would no longer remain a spectator. The time has come, he said, for the continent that has endured centuries of interference to show the world what true leadership looks like. It was audacious, almost unthinkable. Israel dismissed it with a wave of the hand. Naive African posturing. The Palestinian Authority, weary of broken promises, welcomed it but cautiously. The United States warned against unauthorized interventions, a diplomatic phrase cloaked in menace. The European Union raised its eyebrows and muttered about capacity, as if diplomacy were a tool Africa had never been permitted to touch. But Traoré was not reckless. Behind his bold words lay careful calculation. He carried moral authority, a man who had risen from the battlefield of the Sahel, where he had led troops against extremist insurgencies. He knew what it meant to bury soldiers, to see villages torched, to comfort mothers who wept over graves. He brought international partnerships, Moscow and Beijing ready to lend diplomatic cover, shielding his initiative from immediate sabotage. And he brought resources, the gold and uranium of his homeland, bargaining chips in a world addicted to African minerals. The announcement reverberated across Africa. In universities, in markets, in parliaments, people asked, could this really happen? Could one of their own do what the self-proclaimed guardians of world order had failed to do for half a century? In Europe and America, analysts scoffed, yet unease simmered beneath their mockery. If Africa succeeded, what would it say about the legitimacy of their global dominance? In Amman, Jordan, the stage was being set. After weeks of secret back-channel talks on the 29th of May, delegations from both Israel and Palestine agreed to attend preliminary discussions. For the first time in years, a sliver of possibility pierced the dark horizon. The terms were simple but revolutionary. The African Union as neutral moderator, no preconditions for dialogue, immediate focus on humanitarian ceasefire, and international guarantees provided not by the West but by Russia and China. This was not the language of superpowers dictating terms. This was the language of dignity, sovereignty, and shared humanity. Traoré had cracked open a door thought to be sealed forever. Yet as the delegations packed their bags for Jordan, skepticism still lingered. Could a 37-year-old soldier turned president truly succeed where seasoned statesmen had stumbled for decades? The answer would only be revealed in the days to come, behind closed doors, where history waited for a voice that could move hearts before it moved armies. And so the question hung in the air like a storm cloud. Would they walk into Amman to make peace, or to expose Africa's dream as nothing more than an illusion? Amman, Jordan. The city that had seen countless summits now braced itself for one it had never imagined. An African president mediating the longest war of the modern era. In a heavily guarded conference room, beneath chandeliers that once lit banquets of kings, Ibrahim Traoré stood not as a supplicant, but as a conductor preparing to orchestrate the most fragile symphony, peace. From the first day, his approach was unlike anything the region had witnessed. He did not begin with maps, nor with demands, nor with accusations. Instead, he spoke of his homeland. He told stories of villages burned by terrorists, of children who ran barefoot into the night as gunfire crackled, of mothers who carried both babies and grief in their arms. His voice carried the weight of lived suffering, not the cold detachment of diplomats in tailored suits. For 3 days he spoke, and the room fell silent. Israelis and Palestinians listened, not as enemies measuring concessions, but as human beings confronted with a mirror of their own pain. On the 4th day, he asked them to speak, not of politics, but of history, of memory, of wounds carried across generations. He demanded silence from the opposite side as one told their story. No interruptions, no rebuttals, only listening. For a week, the conference room became a confessional, and for the first time in decades, enemies sat across from each other without shouting. The turning point came not in a clause of a treaty, but in a sentence born of anguish. On the 8th day, Traoré rose and declared, "I have seen children killed by terrorists in my villages. I have seen mothers bury their sons. I have seen fathers lose their daughters to senseless violence. This pain knows no nationality, no religion, no politics. Palestinian mothers' tears taste the same as Israeli mothers' tears. The blood of your children is the same red as the blood of mine." The words hung in the air, heavy as stone. A Palestinian delegate, Saib Erekat, later confessed, "Captain Traore spoke to our hearts, not our politics." An Israeli representative, Tzachi Hanegbi, admitted, "His moral authority came not from theory, but from scars we could recognize. He understood our fears without denying theirs." What followed was 15 days of extraordinary progress. Practical solutions emerged. Humanitarian corridors supervised by African Union peacekeepers, prisoner exchanges facilitated by neutral African mediators, monitoring guaranteed by Russia, China, and the African Union. On the 15th of June, pens scratched across paper in what would be remembered as the Aman Accords, a 14-day ceasefire that extended into 30 and then beyond. It was the longest period of sustained calm the region had known in more than a decade. Outside the conference hall, cameras captured a scene few thought possible. Israeli and Palestinian delegates shaking hands under the gaze of an African soldier in a captain's beret. The world gasped. Newspapers called it the Aman miracle. On social media, young Africans declared proudly, "Africa, the peacemaker." But not everyone celebrated. In Washington, London, and Paris, corridors of power stirred uneasily. Western diplomats whispered that African mediation was a dangerous precedent. If Ouagadougou could solve Gaza, what else could it solve? Reports began to surface of backroom operations designed to discredit the agreement, to portray Traoré as a puppet of hostile powers. The peace that had seemed impossible was now under siege, not from rockets or rifles, but from political sabotage. Yet in those early days, in the warm light of Aman, hope had triumphed. For the first time in a generation, Israelis walked through markets without fear of sirens, Palestinians slept without the thunder of bombs, and the world asked a question it had not dared to ask for years. What if peace was truly possible? But as celebrations spread, so did shadows. Because somewhere in the West, plans were already being drawn to ensure that Africa's miracle would not become a permanent revolution. The Amman Accords rippled through the Middle East like a sudden change in wind, unsettling, unexpected, undeniable. For once, the skies above Gaza and Tel Aviv held no smoke. Hospitals, usually crowded with the wounded, turned to the quieter rhythm of treating the sick. Mothers walked through ruined neighborhoods without ducking from sirens. Children returned to schools where chalk once again replaced shrapnel. 4 months passed without a single civilian casualty from military strikes, a record unmatched in over 10 years. Aid flowed through humanitarian corridors guarded not by NATO troops or UN observers, but by African Union peacekeepers in blue helmets marked with the continent's sun. Convoys carried food, medicine, and school supplies, not weapons. In Gaza, African engineers oversaw the rebuilding of classrooms, while in rural Israel, joint agricultural projects between Israeli and Palestinian farmers began, small seeds planted in soil once soaked with blood. The political effect was just as profound. In Palestine, whispers grew. If an African captain could force dialogue, perhaps leaders long entrenched in division could be moved. In Israel, voices once hardened by decades of war began to admit that listening, not bombing, had created this fragile calm. And in Africa, a tide of pride surged. Across 34 capitals, flags of Burkina Faso were flown alongside Palestinian and Israeli banners, symbols of a continent that had, for the first time, exported not raw materials or migrants, but peace. But hope did not go unchallenged. On the 25th of June, only 10 days after the accords were signed, Ibrahim Traoré's convoy was ambushed in Tel Aviv. Sniper fire ripped through the motorcade, striking down his closest aide, Lieutenant Kabore, and wounding Traoré in the shoulder. The bullets were precise, professional. Forensic analysis later revealed the weapons traced back to Western military suppliers. Intelligence about the convoy's movements, investigators confirmed, could only have come from agencies with deep access. The news spread like wildfire. In Ouagadougou, grief turned to fury. 2.3 million citizens flooded the streets, mourning Kabore while cheering their wounded president. They carried signs, "They cannot kill peace." Across Africa, leaders condemned the attack. In Gaza and Tel Aviv, both sides denounced the attempt on the mediator's life. Far from weakening him, the assault elevated Traoré to the status of martyr in waiting, a man so dangerous to the old order that they tried to silence him with bullets. Standing before his people, arm bandaged, voice steady, Traoré declared, "They killed my brother to stop peace. His blood will not be wasted. The ceasefire will hold." The crowd erupted, not in mourning, but in defiance. This was the paradox the West had failed to calculate. Every attempt to sabotage him only deepened his legitimacy. The leaked budgets, $23 million from the CIA, 18 million euros from the DGSE, 12 million pounds from MI6, designed to discredit him instead, revealed the scale of fear his diplomacy provoked. Far from being a proxy, he became a prophet of African dignity. And in that moment, the world witnessed a new chapter. No longer was Africa framed only as a victim of coups or poverty. Now, it was a continent that had produced a leader capable of silencing guns in the most volatile theater of modern history. This was not just a ceasefire. This was a coup of another kind. Not of soldiers storming palaces, but of African wisdom storming the barricades of global diplomacy. It was the Ibrahim Traoré coup, and it had shaken the foundations of international order. Yet as the ceasefire held and Africa celebrated, a larger question lingered in hushed corridors. Would the great powers ever allow this revolution of dignity to last? In the aftermath of the Aman Accords, the world stood divided. To some, the breakthrough was a miracle. To others, it was a threat. The clash was not about the ceasefire itself. It was about who had delivered it. In Washington, the State Department issued cautious statements, praising any step towards peace, while privately fuming that an African soldier had achieved what generations of American envoys could not. Intelligence leaks revealed frantic meetings at Langley and the Pentagon. How could the United States, with all its influence and resources, be outmaneuvered by Ouagadougou? The humiliation was unspoken but palpable. In Brussels, European officials maintained their skepticism. Some members of the European Parliament mocked the initiative as unsustainable African theater. Yet as 4 months of calm stretched into reality, their tone shifted from ridicule to unease. The European Union, long accustomed to lecturing Africa on governance, now faced the irony of watching Africa lecture the world on peace. Meanwhile, in Moscow and Beijing, champagne was uncorked. Russia dispatched additional security teams to protect Traoré's convoy, presenting itself as the guardian of African diplomacy. China announced funding for African conflict resolution institutes, branding the moment as proof that the 21st century belongs to the global South. For both powers, Traoré's success was not merely about peace in the Middle East. It was about rewriting the script of global leadership. Religious and moral authorities added their voices. The Vatican invited Traoré to a private audience with Pope Francis, praising his moral clarity in a time of darkness. The United Nations Secretary General lauded the African Union for pioneering a fresh template for conflict resolution. Over 100 international scholars submitted a joint nomination of Traoré for the Nobel Peace Prize. Academic conferences quickly coined the phrase the Ouagadougou method to describe his blend of cultural wisdom, moral authority, and practical neutrality. Across Africa, the symbolism was electrifying. Presidents Ramaphosa of South Africa and Kenyatta of Kenya hailed the Amman Accords as proof that Africa could no longer be treated as a diplomatic afterthought. Youth movements echoed the sentiment on social media. Africa is not a problem. Africa is the solution. The phrase spread beyond borders, igniting a quiet revolution of perception. This was no longer only about the Middle East. It was about reclaiming dignity, rewriting Africa's place in the hierarchy of nations. It was about a continent that had for centuries been lectured to, now offering lessons of its own. The world called it diplomacy. Africans called it something else, the beginning of the Burkina Faso Revolution. But revolutions do not end with applause. They attract resistance, fear, and countermoves. And in the months ahead, the battle for Africa's diplomatic future was only beginning. As the ceasefire in Gaza and the West Bank held beyond all expectations, one question lingered. What comes next? For Ibrahim Traoré, the Aman Accords were not the end of a journey, but the opening of a road that stretched far beyond the Middle East. Requests soon poured in. From Eastern Europe, Ukraine discreetly approached African mediators, asking whether the same method that had quieted Gaza could be attempted between Kyiv and Moscow. In the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia and Eritrea, locked in their own cycles of hostility, signaled openness to Burkina Faso's involvement. In North Africa, Algeria and Mali whispered about possible intervention in their disputes. Chad and Sudan appealed directly to the African Union for continental mediation under Traoré's guidance. To institutionalize this wave of trust, Ouagadougou founded the African Peace Institute, a center for training mediators, archiving African traditions of conflict resolution, and providing a permanent network of negotiators ready to travel wherever dialogue was needed. For the first time in modern history, Africa was not importing peacekeepers. It was exporting them. The opportunities were immense. An Africa that could solve conflicts was an Africa no longer trapped in the image of dependency. Trade partnerships would strengthen, diplomatic respect would grow, and younger generations could finally believe in leadership that did not beg but offered. For many, this was the true harvest of sovereignty, not only resisting foreign exploitation, but shaping global outcomes. Yet risks lurked. Western powers, embarrassed by their failure, would not stand idly by. Their sabotage had already turned lethal in Tel Aviv, and intelligence analysts warned of new efforts. Financial pressure, disinformation, covert operations, all designed to discredit African diplomacy before it became a permanent fixture. The question was no longer whether Traoré could deliver peace, but whether he could survive the storm his success had unleashed. For the people of Africa, however, the answer was clear. On the 15th of July, when 2.3 million filled the streets of Ouagadougou, they were not only welcoming a president, they were welcoming an era. Flags of Israel and Palestine waved beside the Burkinabe tricolor, symbols of a continent claiming its rightful place at the table of nations. This was more than a ceasefire. It was a signal flare for a new century, a century in which Africa would no longer be the silent soil upon which others wrote their stories, but the road upon which humanity might walk towards peace. And so the question that echoed was not if Africa could rise, but how long the world could deny that its rise had already begun. From the deserts of Gaza to the streets of Ouagadougou, the story of Ibrahim Traoré is no longer just a tale of one man. It is the story of a continent declaring its voice. For decades, peace in the Middle East had been the theater of superpowers, a stage upon which Western diplomats promised much and delivered little. Then came a soldier from Burkina Faso who turned the script upside down. The Aman Accords were more than a ceasefire. They were a revelation that dignity, empathy, and lived experience could succeed where armies and empires had failed. 4 months of silence in Gaza's skies, 0 civilian casualties, schools reopening, and aid flowing freely. These were not statistics. They were signs that another path was possible. Traoré's journey was not without blood. The death of Lieutenant Kabore and the sniper's bullet that grazed his shoulder proved that peace has enemies, that a new world order is never born without pain. Yet instead of weakening his mission, the attempt to silence him only amplified his voice. It was a coup not of tanks or guns, but of moral authority, the Ibrahim Traoré coup, and it has redrawn the map of diplomacy. What began in Burkina Faso is now inspiring nations from Ukraine to Sudan, proving that the Burkina Faso revolution is not confined to one border, one people, or one conflict. It is a revolution of perception. Africa is no longer a passive recipient of aid, but an active architect of peace. The world must now confront a simple truth. If a small, landlocked nation, scarred by terrorism, can bring Israelis and Palestinians to the same table, what excuse remains for others who claim peace is impossible? Brothers and sisters, history is being rewritten in real time. Africa has stepped onto the stage not as a follower, but as a leader. If this resonates with your sense of justice, do not remain silent. Share this story, comment with your voice, and subscribe to walk with us on this journey. Because the coup of Ibrahim Traoré has already begun, and its revolution is one the world can no longer ignore.